What's going on, y'all? Mushroom Kingdom here. Back again. Let's get ready for another edition of the Muffin Man, Part 3. Y'all gonna love this one.
Chapter X, Blood for Blood. McNabb stood outside Mercer's apartment, the crime scene tape fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. Officers moved in and out, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Even the hardened crime scene techs looked shaken. Mercer had been one of them, untouchable, sharp, always 5 steps ahead. Now she was just another body. McNabb stepped inside, his fists clenched at his sides. The air was still thick with steam, the smell of blood and something worse curling in his throat. The bathtub was still full, dark, murky, tainted. The white tile was streaked red where her head had been placed on the edge of the tub. A crime scene tech hesitated before speaking. It was clean, too clean, like he took his time. McNabb's jaw tightened. That was his style. He didn't just kill, he made it a ritual, a performance, and he wanted McNabb to see it. Sandoval entered behind him, keeping a careful distance. "Sir?" McNabb didn't answer. He just stared at the blueberry muffin sitting neatly beside where Mercer's head had been, mocking him, taunting him. Sandoval cleared his throat. "What now?" McNabb exhaled slowly, his voice cold. "Now," he turned, his eyes dark. "Now we stop playing defense." A pause. "We hunt him like a goddamn animal." Peter sat at his kitchen table, the morning news droning softly in the background. The anchors were whispering about Mercer's murder, their fear barely concealed behind their professional tones. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest. Across from him, Claire sat stiffly, staring at the screen. Her hands were curled around her mug, her fingers pale. "They said it was brutal," she murmured. Peter smiled faintly, stirring his coffee. "She got too close." Claire looked at him sharply. "What?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "She got too close to the wrong thing." Claire swallowed hard. They say it was him." Peter's smile widened. "Of course it was." "Would you like the next scene to follow McNabb's next move, or Claire?" Chapter X, The Hunter and the Hunted. McNabb's warpath. McNabb didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't stop moving. Mercer's murder had done something to him, something irreversible. It had broken something inside, snapped the last restraint that had been holding him back. This wasn't just a case anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was personal. He stood in the precinct's briefing room, a large city map pinned to the wall, covered in red string and scribbled notes. Officers sat around him, silent, waiting. McNabb lit a cigarette, his movements sharp, deliberate. He exhaled, then stabbed a finger at the map. "He's slipping up." His voice was low, dangerous. "The broadcast, the bakery suppliers, Mercer, he's getting bold. That means he thinks we can't touch him." A pause. "He's wrong." Sandoval nodded. "Where do we start?" McNabb turned, his eyes dark. "Every supplier, every old case file, every goddamn traffic cam near the crime scenes. I want it all cross-checked. No more reaction. No more waiting." He crushed the cigarette into an ashtray. "We find him. And we end this." Claire's doubt. Claire felt sick. The news replayed the details over and over. The profiler boiled alive, her head severed. The signature muffin. The city was in panic mode, and all she could do was sit there, her tea growing cold in her hands. But what unsettled her more than the crime itself was Peter. He wasn't horrified, wasn't disturbed. He just watched, calm, amused even. She turned to him. "It doesn't bother you?" Peter glanced at her. "What doesn't?" She hesitated. "The murder, the profiler, this monster running around." Peter smirked. "I don't scare easily, Claire." Claire stared at him. Something in his eyes, something deep, dark, and wrong, sent a chill through her. She had never questioned him before. Now, she wasn't sure she could stop. "Would you like Claire to start investigating Peter, or have McNabb and Claire?" Chapter X, Beneath the Surface. Claire couldn't shake the feeling. It started as a whisper in the back of her mind. Something's not right. But the more she watched Peter, the more the whisper grew into a roar. He was too calm, too detached. While the entire city was unraveling, he carried on as if nothing had changed. As if Mercer's brutal murder, the beheading, the boiling, the goddamn muffin, was nothing more than background noise, and then there was the way he had looked at her. That smirk, that slight knowing glint in his eyes. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay beside him, watching him breathe, listening, waiting. And when his breathing slowed, when she was sure he was asleep, she got up. The search begins. The house was dark, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Claire moved carefully, heart hammering in her chest, every creak of the floorboards making her stomach clench. She had never snooped through Peter's things before, never had a reason to. But now she couldn't not look. She started with his office. Peter was meticulous, neat. Nothing seemed out of place. Books lined the shelves. Papers were stacked in precise order. But when she checked the desk drawers, her hands shaking slightly, she found nothing. No personal files, no receipts, no past. It was as if Peter hadn't existed before meeting her. Claire's throat tightened. Then her eyes landed on the basement door. A locked door. Peter never let her in the basement. Not once in the entire time they had lived together. It was always his space, his bakery projects, his private workshop. But now she stood in front of it, her hand hovering over the knob. She twisted it. Locked, of course it was. Claire exhaled slowly. Think. She moved to the laundry room, rifling through the small dish where Peter tossed spare change, receipts, keys. And there it was, a single silver key. She swallowed hard, gripping it tightly as she stepped back toward the door. If she opened it, there would be no going back. No unseeing, no pretending. She slid the key into the lock, turned it, and stepped inside. Chapter 2, another offering. The city was already broken. People weren't just afraid anymore. They were paralyzed. The streets emptied before sundown, businesses shut down without notice, and the police were drowning in dead-end leads. And yet, the Muffin Man still wasn't finished. He was never finished. Her name was Jessica Rowe, 26, a paralegal who worked late shifts at a downtown law firm. She wasn't reckless, wasn't stupid. She had read the headlines, had seen the warnings, had whispered the name like everyone else. She wasn't supposed to be outside. But she had no choice. Her car had stalled outside the parking garage, just 2 blocks from her apartment, close enough that she thought, maybe she could make it. She pulled her coat tight, moving quickly, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. The city around her was unnaturally quiet. She never saw him coming. One moment she was fumbling for her keys, the next, a shadow, a hand clamped over her mouth, cold steel pressed against her throat, and then darkness. The crime scene. They found her body the next morning. She had been posed carefully in an alleyway downtown, her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky. Her mouth sewn shut. And on her chest, a single fresh blueberry muffin. No fingerprints, no DNA, just another message. A reminder, he wasn't done. Not even close. Would you like McNabb to respond to this murder next, or should the Muffin Man prepare another message for the city? Chapter X, The Boy in the Dark. His name was Ethan Miller, 10 years old, a quiet, bookish kid who never got into trouble. He had heard the warnings. His parents had drilled them into his head. Don't say the name, don't go out after dark, don't trust anyone. And he listened, until the night he didn't. The vanishing. Ethan's mother had stepped out for just a moment. A quick run to the corner store, leaving him alone for less than 10 minutes. When she returned, the house was silent. The front door, slightly open. Her heart stopped. Ethan, she called, stepping inside. No answer. The air was heavy, wrong. A terrible, suffocating stillness settled over the house. She searched the living room, his bedroom, the kitchen. Nothing. And then she saw it, sitting neatly on the dining table. A single muffin. Her scream shattered the night. The search. The city launched a full-scale manhunt. The media ran Ethan's photo everywhere. A school picture, smiling and bright, now a symbol of pure, aching terror. The news anchors didn't say his name, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew. McNabb was at the precinct when the call came in. Another missing child, another goddamn muffin. He gritted his teeth, his grip on the case files white-knuckled tight. He's playing with us, Sandoval muttered, taking his time. McNabb exhaled sharply. Then we find him first. Would you like the next scene to follow McNabb's desperate search for Ethan, or the Muffin Man revealing what he's done with the boy? Chapter 6, The Boy in the Dark. Smiling, his grip revealing what he's done with the boy. Chapter X. And he listened. Slightly open. Saw it, sitting neatly on the news anchors didn't... Sandoval muttered, taking his time. McNabb exhaled sharply. Then we find him first. Would you like the next scene to follow McNabb's desperate search for Ethan, or the Muffin Man revealing what he's done with the boy?
I'm still don't want to read, y'all. I'm sorry.
Chapter T. The hunt begins. McNabb didn't stop moving. He barely remembered getting into his car, barely heard the police radio crackling with voices trying to reel him back in. He didn't care. The Garcia family's blood was still wet. The air in that house still thick with death. That bastard was out there, somewhere, watching, laughing. McNabb's fingers clenched around the steering wheel as he sped through the city, the streetlights blurring past him. Your move, McNabb. The words burned in his skull. Fine, he'd make his move. The list. He didn't have a plan. Not yet, but he had a list. 3 locations, 3 suppliers that carried the rare flour found at every single crime scene. He had barely missed him last time. Not tonight. The first location was a small bakery on the east side. Closed, dark, empty. McNabb didn't hesitate. He kicked the door in, the frame splintering under the force. Inside, nothing. Flour dusted the counters. Baking trays sat stacked neatly, no sign of him. McNabb's jaw tightened. Back in the car. Next location. The second stop. A warehouse near the docks. McNabb parked haphazardly, yanking his gun from his holster as he moved toward the loading bay. Something felt off. The doors were unlocked. Inside, pallets of supplies were stacked high. Sugar, flour, yeast, and something else. McNabb's pulse spiked as he spotted it, a single muffin, placed perfectly in the center of an empty metal table. He raised his gun, moving carefully, his heartbeat hammering. Then, a noise. Behind him. A flicker of movement, a shadow. McNabb spun around, finger tightening on the trigger, but there was nothing. Just the silence. The waiting. The game. The third stop. The trap. McNabb's tires screeched as he pulled up to the final location. An abandoned bakery on the outskirts of the city. No lights, no signs of life. But McNabb felt him. His stomach coiled tight. His instincts screamed. He stepped out of the car, gun drawn, heart pounding. One step at a time, he entered the dark, and the door creaked shut behind him. Would you look? Chapter X. The dreams he walks in. It started slowly. A few children waking up screaming, parents chalking it up to nightmares, bad dreams, too much TV, then more. Whole classrooms of kids, pale and exhausted, dark circles under their tiny eyes. Teachers whispered in the halls. Chapter X. The nightmare in their heads. Los Angeles had changed. The streets were empty, the city barely breathed. But the ones who felt it the most, the ones who truly understood the terror, were the children. They knew. They always knew. The whispered name. At Windsor Elementary, recess wasn't the same anymore. The swings swayed untouched. The basketball court sat silent. The laughter that once filled the air, gone. Instead, the kids huddled together in corners, whispering. Did you hear about the family? They say he cut them open, took their insides out. My mom said if you say his name, he comes for you. But what if you whisper it? The group went still. A boy, Ryan, 8 years old, hesitated, looked around, then leaned in closer. Muffin, ma? A girl shoved him, panic wide in her eyes. You can't say it, she hissed. Ryan froze, his little heart hammering in his chest. Across the playground, a teacher watched. The adults didn't talk about him, but the kids knew. They felt him. And every night when the city lights flickered and the wind howled through the empty streets, they all lay awake in their beds, staring at their closet doors, their windows, their dark hallways, waiting, listening. Because if you said his name, he would come. Would you like to explore how schools enforce the rule against saying the Muffin Man's name, or follow a child who... Chapter 10, The Dreams He Walks In. It started slowly. A few children waking up screaming. Parents chalking it up to nightmares, bad dreams, too much TV. Then more. Whole classrooms of kids, pale and exhausted, dark circles under their tiny eyes. Teachers whispered in the halls. Parents started keeping their children home. Something was wrong. And the kids, they knew. The nightmare. It always started the same way. They were alone, standing in an empty playground under a dim, flickering streetlight. The swings creaked without wind. The merry-go-round spun on its own. And then the footsteps, slow, heavy, coming closer. A shadow stretching too long, too far, creeping along the cracked pavement. The children couldn't move, couldn't scream, only watch. And then they saw him. Not a man, not a monster, something in between. His face was always wrong. Sometimes it shifted. Sometimes it wasn't there at all. But the smile, that never changed. Cold, wide, hungry, and in his hand, a muffin. They always woke up before he reached them. But every night, he came closer. The parents' terror. Hospitals saw an uptick in children's sleep disorders. Pediatricians diagnosed them with night terrors, but the parents, they knew better. Their kids weren't just scared. They were haunted. And no one could stop it. Because no one could stop him. Would you like the next... Chapter X, When Nightmares Become Real. It was one thing for kids to wake up screaming. But when one of them didn't wake up at all, that's when the city finally broke. The missing boy. 7-year-old Oliver Tate had been having the nightmares like all the other children. His parents had tried everything. Warm milk before bed, a nightlight, leaving the door open just a crack. None of it helped. He would wake up gasping, clutching his blankets, crying that he was getting closer. Then, one morning, Oliver's bed was empty. The covers were still tucked neatly around where his small body had been. The window was locked from the inside. No forced entry, no broken glass, nothing, except for one thing. On the pillow, right where Oliver's head should have been, a blueberry muffin, still warm. The city's panic. This was different. The media could report on brutal murders, and people would lock their doors. They could talk about a family being gutted, and the city would grieve. But a child vanishing from his own bed? That wasn't just murder. That was something worse. People whispered about it in hushed voices, afraid that even acknowledging it would make them next. The Muffin Man can get inside your head. He's in the dreams. If you see him in your sleep, you don't wake up. McNabb's breaking point. The crime scene was intact. No evidence, no fingerprints. McNabb had nothing. Again. And that was the part that made him want to rip the walls down. He stood in Oliver's bedroom, staring at the untouched sheets, the small stuffed dinosaur lying on the floor. A goddamn child. Taken right out of his own bed. McNabb clenched his jaw so hard it ached. Sandoval stood in the doorway, quiet. Sir, if he can get inside their dreams... Don't, McNabb cut him off. His voice was hoarse, sharp, desperate. Don't start that bullshit with me. Sandoval hesitated. Then explain how a kid disappears from a locked room with no sign of forced entry. Chapter 10, When Nightmares Become Real. Chapter X, Trapped in the Nightmare. Miles Jensen was 6 years old. He didn't know about the murders. His parents had stopped watching the news when things got bad. They told themselves if they didn't talk about it, if they didn't think about it, then it wouldn't touch them. But it didn't matter, because the Muffin Man didn't need a television to find you. He just needed you to sleep. Miles stood on the playground. He didn't know how he got there. He didn't remember waking up or getting out of bed. He just was. The swings creaked in the wind. The jungle gym stretched tall and dark against the night sky. And the merry-go-round? It was spinning, even though no one was touching it. His breath came faster. Something was wrong. He turned, stopped. There, beneath the street lamp, stood a man, still, unmoving, watching. Miles couldn't see his face, but he saw the smile. Wide, cold, waiting, and in his hand, a muffin, fresh, steaming, like it had just come out of the oven. Miles tried to run. His feet wouldn't move. He tried to scream. His throat locked shut. The man took a step forward, then another, then the whisper. "Did you miss me?" The real world. Miles's mother woke to the sound of screaming, not the kind of cry from a bad dream, the kind of scream that curdled blood. She bolted from bed, nearly tripping over herself as she ran down the hall. "Miles," she gasped, shoving open the door. He was thrashing, drenched in sweat. His tiny fingers clawed at his sheets, his mouth open in a silent scream. She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. "Miles, wake up, baby, wake up." His eyes snapped open, wild, terrified. His little body shuddered as he gasped for air, his breath coming in broken sobs. But he wasn't looking at her. His wide, tear-filled eyes were locked on something behind her. The corner of the room. Dark, empty. But to Miles, not empty at all. Would you like to follow more children being haunted in their sleep, or shift to the Muffin Man enjoying the terror he's spreading? Chapter X, The Fear That Never Sleeps. Miles didn't stop screaming. His mother tried to hold him, tried to convince him he was safe. But the moment his eyes had locked onto that dark corner, something broke inside of him. He didn't talk, didn't move, didn't blink. His little chest rose and fell with shallow, panicked breaths, his fingers clutching the bedsheet so hard his knuckles turned white. His mother tried again. "Baby, what is it? What did you see?" Miles swallowed hard. His tiny voice barely made a sound. He was here. Her stomach dropped. "Who?" she whispered. Miles slowly turned his head to her. "The Muffin Man." She screamed, not because of his words, but because his breath smelled like muffins, like he had just bitten into one. The news spreads. By morning, Miles wasn't the only one. Dozens of children woke up the same way, screaming, crying, frozen in fear. More parents reported their kids refusing to sleep, terrified that if they closed their eyes, he'd be waiting. Hospitals were flooded with exhausted children, their little bodies too weak to fight off the terror that had infected them. Doctors called it a mass hysteria event. Parents knew better. And the kids? They stopped talking altogether. Because if they said his name, he might come back. Elsewhere, Peter sat at his kitchen table, stirring his coffee, watching the morning news. Reporters whispered about the wave of night terrors. Doctors scrambled to explain why so many children were too afraid to sleep. Peter took a slow sip. He didn't need to hear the details. He already knew. He had been there. He had walked in their dreams. And soon, he wouldn't just haunt them in their sleep. He'd take one. For real. Would you like the next scene to... Chapter X, the next message. The package arrived at KXLA Studios just after noon. No return address, no markings, just a simple black envelope with a single muffin crumb pressed into the flap. The receptionist hesitated before opening it. Inside there was USB drive and a note. 4 words. Play this. They'll listen. The broadcast. KXLA debated whether to air it. The last time the Muffin Man had hijacked a broadcast, the city spiraled into chaos. The network nearly collapsed under government scrutiny, but curiosity won, fear won. They played it. The screen flickered, at first just static, a faint, distant humming like an old radio struggling for signal. Then the image snapped into focus. A room, dim, cramped, a single flickering light bulb swayed above. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, crime scene photos, McNabb's face circled in red ink. And then a shadow shifted in the corner of the frame. Slow, deliberate. A gloved hand reached forward, dragging something across the table. A muffin. It was placed directly in front of the camera. Then the voice, low, distorted, crawling through the speakers like a whisper inside the skull. You can feel it, can't you? A pause. The city breaking. The people unraveling. The children waiting. A faint chuckle. They see me in their dreams now. They can't run. They can't wake up. Static rippled through the screen. The image jumped. Now it showed something else. A bedroom. A child's bed. The blankets were neatly tucked. A small stuffed bear rested against the pillow. And on the nightstand, a fresh muffin. The voice returned, softer now. Sleep tight, Los Angeles. The screen cut to fallout. People lost their minds. Parents ripped their kids out of school. The mayor demanded answers. And McNabb? He sat in his office, staring at the frozen image of the child's bedroom. His gut was screaming at him. This wasn't a taunt. It was a promise. The next child wouldn't just dream about the Muffin Man. They'd never wake up. Would you like McNabb? Chapter X, The Next Child. It had been 2 days since the broadcast. 2 days since the entire city watched the Muffin Man place a muffin on a child's nightstand. 2 days since parents stopped letting their kids sleep without the lights on, without checking the closets, without whispering prayers under their breath. It didn't matter, because tonight he would take one. The boy who wouldn't wake up. Daniel Brooks was 5 years old. A sweet, quiet kid who still clutched his favorite stuffed rabbit when he slept. His parents had done everything right. Locked the doors, checked the windows, stayed up listening for every little sound. But the Muffin Man didn't need doors. He didn't need windows. He just needed Daniel to close his eyes. And Daniel was so tired. His parents had kept him awake as long as they could, but exhaustion won. His little body sank into the blankets. His breathing slowed. And as sleep took him, he found himself standing in the playground. The swings moved without wind. The merry-go-round creaked, spinning slowly, and under the dim glow of the streetlight, a man stood waiting. Daniel tried to run, but his feet sank into the ground. Like quicksand, the man tilted his head, smiled, and took a step forward, then another, and another, until Daniel could feel his breath. "It's time to go," Daniel screamed. But in the real world, he never made a sound. The empty bed. His mother woke with a start. Something felt wrong. She reached for her son, half asleep, expecting to feel his little body curled beside her. Her hand met cold sheets. Her heart stopped. "Daniel?" she whispered, sitting up. The nightlight glowed softly. His blankets were still neatly tucked. His stuffed rabbit lay next to his pillow. But Daniel? Gone. Her breath hitched. She threw the blankets aside, frantically checking under the bed, in the closet, in the hallway. "Daniel!" Her husband stirred. "What's wrong?" Her voice broke. "He's not here." The house was locked. The alarm system never went off. But their child was gone, and on his nightstand, a blueberry muffin. The call that changed everything. McNabb was at his desk when his phone rang. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to hear what he already knew. Chapter X, The Next Child. It had been 2 days since the broadcast. 2 days since the entire city watched the Muffin Man place a muffin on a child's nightstand. 2 days since parents stopped letting their kids sleep without the lights on, without checking the closets, without whispering prayers under their breath. It didn't matter, because tonight he would take one. The boy who wouldn't wake up. Daniel Brooks was 5 years old. A sweet, quiet kid who still clutched his favorite stuffed rabbit when he slept. His parents had done everything right. Locked the doors, checked the windows, stayed up listening for every little sound. But the Muffin Man didn't need doors. He didn't need windows. He just needed Daniel to close his eyes. And Daniel was so tired. His parents had kept him awake as long as they could, but exhaustion won. His little body sank into the blankets. His breathing slowed, and as sleep took him, he found himself standing in the playground. The swings moved without wind, the merry-go-round creaked, spinning slowly, and under the dim glow of the streetlight, a man stood waiting. Daniel tried to run, but his feet sank into the ground, like quicksand. The man tilted his head, smiled, and took a step forward, then another and another, until Daniel could feel his breath. "It's time to go," Daniel screamed. But in the real world, he never made a sound. Chapter first, real lead. McNabb didn't waste time. This wasn't just another murder. This wasn't just another message. This was a child, and for the first time, the Muffin Man had made a mistake. The clue. The forensic team scoured the Brooks home from top to bottom. There was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no security footage of anyone coming or going. But then, a discovery. On the bedroom window frame, invisible to the naked eye but glowing under blacklight, flour, the same rare blend found at the Garcia crime scene. McNabb's pulse spiked. This was it, the first physical connection between the Muffin Man and an abduction. He turned to Sandoval, his voice tight. "We're not stopping this time. We hit every supplier in the city, right now." Sandoval nodded, already pulling out his phone. "Yes, sir." McNabb took one last look at the bedroom. The untouched stuffed rabbit, the tiny bed still warm, and the goddamn muffin. His stomach churned. He didn't know if Daniel Brooks was still alive, but for the first time, he had a trail, and he was going to follow it to the end. Elsewhere, the boy shivered. His feet were bare. The floor beneath him was cold. The air smelled sweet, like sugar and something rotten. He was in a kitchen, a dark, empty kitchen. Daniel whimpered, hugging himself. He didn't know how he got here, didn't know where his mommy was. But he knew one thing. He wasn't alone. Somewhere in the shadows, he was watching and waiting. "Would you like McNabb to close in on the muffin?" Chapter X, the place where no one screams. Daniel wasn't alone. Somewhere in the shadows something shifted, a slow, deliberate movement. He pressed himself into the corner, his tiny body shaking, his bare feet curled against the cold tiles, his breath coming in quick panic gasps. "Mommy?" he whispered. No answer, only the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, coming closer. Then a voice. "You don't have to be scared, Daniel." The voice was soft, calm. Wrong. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. "It's better if you don't fight." A hand touched his hair. But no one heard, because in this place, in this dark, quiet place, no one could hear you scream. McNabb's chase. McNabb's tires screeched as he tore down the freeway. The list of flour suppliers had shrunk. One of them, a small abandoned bakery on the city outskirts, had no records of a legal owner. No invoices, no paperwork, nothing. It didn't exist, but someone had been there recently, and McNabb knew who. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. This was it. If Daniel was still alive, he was here. McNabb pressed harder on the gas. "Hold on, kid. I'm coming." The moment before the end. Back in the kitchen, Daniel sobbed. The shadow crouched in front of him. "Shh," the voice whispered. "It's almost over." A blade glinted in the dim light. A muffin was placed neatly on the counter, and the Muffin Man smiled, because he knew McNabb was too late. "Would you like McNabb to arrive?" Chapter X, the next message. It arrived at the LAPD precinct the next morning. A small, nondescript box placed neatly at the front desk. No return address, no markings, only McNabb's name. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to open it. Sandoval swallowed hard. "Sir." McNabb didn't hesitate. He ripped the box open and immediately wished he hadn't. Inside the box, the first thing he saw was a muffin. Of course, perfect. Blueberry had placed just so. Then something else. A teddy bear. Small, worn, stained with blood. McNabb's throat tightened. He had seen it before. It had been on Daniel's bed. A piece of the kid's life, now a trophy. Sandoval took a step back, his face pale. Jesus Christ. McNabb barely heard him. Because at the bottom of the box, nestled between the bear and the muffin, a Polaroid. His hands shook as he picked it up. At first, it was just darkness, a grainy, shadowed image. Then, as his eyes adjusted, Daniel Brooks, still alive, still whole, lying in bed tucked under his covers, asleep. The timestamp? 2:37 a.m., the same night he disappeared. Before the murder, before the gutting, before McNabb ever knew he was missing. McNabb's hands clenched into fists, his breath was ragged, because the Muffin Man had been in the house. He had stood over the boy, had watched him sleep, had taken his time, and written in neat, childlike scrawl at the bottom of the Polaroid, "Still too slow, Johnny." McNabb snapped. The picture crumpled in his grip as he slammed his fist into the desk, sending pink papers and pens flying. Officers jumped, startled. Sandoval flinched. No one said a word, because they had all just realized the truth. This wasn't about killing anymore. This was about McNabb. The Muffin Man was playing with him, and McNabb didn't know if he could. Chapter X, Fractured Mind. McNabb locked himself in his office. The precinct buzzed outside his door, officers murmuring, paperwork shuffling, phones ringing, but it all felt far away. The box sat on his desk, open, waiting, the muffin, the bear, the picture. His hands hovered over the Polaroid, fingers twitching. He didn't want to touch it again, didn't want to look at it. But he had to, because the Muffin Man had left it for him. Not just to taunt him, to break him. McNabb exhaled through his nose, slow, measured. His pulse hammered in his skull. He turned the picture over. More writing. Neat. Careful. Mocking. "We're not so different, you and me." McNabb's chest tightened. The words blurred as his vision tunneled. His breath felt too shallow. His skin too hot. He shoved the photo away. His shaking fingers reached for the bottle of whiskey in his desk drawer. One drink, then another and another. The room spun. "We're not so different, you and me." McNabb squeezed his eyes shut. No. He wasn't like him. He wasn't. The sound of laughter, low, deep, inside his head. His eyes snapped open. He was alone. The room was empty. But for a split second, just a split second, he swore he saw a shadow move in the corner. A whisper. "Still too slow, Johnny." McNabb grabbed the bottle and hurled it at the wall. Glass shattered. Whiskey splattered across his desk, dripping onto the files, onto the photo. McNabb sat back, his body heaving, his hands numb. He had never been this far gone. And that's when it hit him. That's when he realized this wasn't just a game anymore. This was personal. The Muffin Man wasn't just taunting him. He was changing him, turning him into something else. And McNabb didn't know if he could stop it. McNabb sat in the wreckage of his own office. Whiskey dripped from the desk onto the floor. The shattered glass glinted under the flickering light. The Polaroid, now stained with liquor, lay mocking him. His heart pounded in his chest. His hands shook. He needed to move. Now, before the Muffin Man took another child, before another body was gutted open, before he lost himself completely. The pattern no one saw. The answer had to be in the case files. McNabb grabbed the nearest stack of reports, flipping through them with wild desperation. He knew the flower shipments had gotten him close before, but what if there was something else? Something hidden in plain sight. He laid out every crime scene photo, every timeline, every murder. His bloodshot eyes scanned for connections. And then he saw it. His breath caught. Every major kill, every public spectacle, every staged murder, every muffin left behind, they all formed a shape. A rough, jagged spiral. And at the center of it, a single point on the map. An abandoned lot. Forgotten, unremarkable, except for one thing. It used to be a bakery, a long time ago. McNabb staggered back. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't just where the Muffin Man was hiding. This was where it all began. And if McNabb was right, then the Muffin Man was already waiting for him. Elsewhere, Peter sat in the darkness of his home, watching the news spiral. The media was eating itself alive. The city was crippled with fear. And McNabb was on the edge. Peter smirked, sipping his coffee. Almost there, Johnny. Almost ready to break. And when that moment came, when the detective finally snapped, Peter would be right there, waiting. Smiling. like he always had. Chapter X, Into the Devil's Den. McNabb didn't call for backup. He didn't check in, didn't tell Sandoval, didn't tell anyone. Because this wasn't about a case anymore. This was personal. So he drove alone, through the dead streets of Los Angeles, past the empty storefronts, the flickering neon signs, the silent homes where people huddled behind locked doors. They were afraid of the Muffin Man. They should have been afraid of him. Because tonight, he wasn't walking into this place as a cop. He was walking in as something else, something darker, something the Muffin Man had been trying to create all along. And maybe it was working. The building was long abandoned, a husk of what it once was. The sign out front had crumbled, the paint peeling, windows boarded up. But McNabb knew he was in the right place, because the door was unlocked. He stepped inside. The air was thick, sweet, the overwhelming scent of muffins, as if they had just been baked. His stomach coiled. This wasn't a crime scene, it was a graveyard. And McNabb knew the Muffin Man was already here, waiting, watching, smiling. The dark descent. McNabb moved deeper into the building, gun drawn. The floor creaked beneath his boots. His breath came slow, measured. He followed the scent, through the abandoned kitchen, past the rusted ovens, down a narrow hallway where the walls seemed to close in, and at the very end, a staircase leading down. McNabb exhaled, of course, because the Muffin Man had never been a man of light. He belonged in the dark. McNabb stepped down, one step, then another. The deeper he went, the thicker the air became. The scent of muffins was rotting now. And at the very bottom, a door, slightly open. McNabb raised his gun, pushed forward, and stepped into hell. Would you like McNabb to find some... Chapter Basement. The door groaned as McNabb pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, thick with the scent of rotting sugar and blood. Something dripped. McNabb stepped inside, his boots squelching against the floor. His fingers tightened around his gun. Then the lights flickered on, and McNabb's breath hitched. The Muffin Man's playground. The basement was not empty. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, articles of every murder, every victim, every failure. Photos of McNabb, his house, his car, his childhood, pinned up in perfect order. A shrine, a tribute, and in the center of the room, a baking table, lined with muffins, all the same, all fresh, except for one. McNabb swallowed hard, because this muffin, this one was different. It had a bullet pressed into the center, his bullet from his service weapon, and next to it, written in Daniel Brooks' blood. Do you get it now, Johnny? The voice in the dark. A slow clap echoed through the room. McNabb spun, gun raised, and from the shadows, he stepped out. Not a myth, not a nightmare, a man. Peter smiled. His apron was clean, his hands were calm, his eyes wild, hungry, knowing. Welcome to my kitchen, detective. McNabb's jaw clenched. His hand shook. This was it, the end of the game. One way or another, only one of them was walking out. Would you like McNabb to hesitate, giving the Muffin Man an advantage, or go in guns blazing for a final showdown? Chapter X. The nightmare never ends. McNabb's world tilted. Blood soaked through his shirt, dripping onto the floor. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. And Peter? Peter should have been dead. The knife was still buried deep in his stomach. His body was still slumped against the cold tile. His breath was shallow, weak. But that smile, that goddamn smile wouldn't fade. See you soon, Johnny. Staggered back. The room spun. His fingers were slick with his own blood. Peter's eyes, his body twitched. A low, choking laugh bubbled up from his throat, like he knew something McNabb didn't. Like this was all part of the plan. McNabb gritted his teeth. Not this time. With everything he had left, he grabbed his gun from the floor, aimed it between Peter's eyes. No more games. McNabb's voice was hoarse, broken. No more warnings, no more muffins. This ends. Then, the lights went out, total. Black, the vanishing act, a heartbeat. Then, the sound of movement, something wet dragging across the floor. McNabb spun, blind in the darkness. His pulse hammered. He listened, straining to hear anything. Another sound. Footsteps. McNabb's grip tightened around his gun. His chest rose and fell fast. He reached into his pocket, fumbled for his lighter, flicked it open. A small flickering flame illuminated the darkness. And Peter? Gone. No body, no blood, only the knife, still slick, lying in the center of the room. And on the table a fresh muffin. McNabb's stomach dropped. He stepped forward, heart pounding. There was something written in the flour dust on the counter. A single word. Faster. McNabb's fingers clenched, his chest heaved. A slow, sinking realization curled around his spine. This wasn't over. It was never over. Because the Muffin Man was still out there, still watching, still smiling. And McNabb, he would never catch him. The final scene. Somewhere in the city, a man walked into a bakery. Calm, clean, untouched by blood. The girl behind the counter smiled as he approached. "What can I get for you today?" The man smiled back. "Just a muffin, blackout." Epilogue: The hunt never ends. McNabb didn't sleep anymore, not really. He closed his eyes, sure, drifted for a while, but every time he did, he saw him. Standing at the edge of the dark, watching, smiling, waiting, every night. Though the city never recovered. Los Angeles had tried to move on. The news stopped saying his name. The mayor promised they were turning a corner. The streets started to fill again, little by little, but the fear never really left. Parents still checked their children's beds. People still locked their doors early, and in the places no one talked about, they still whispered, because no one had found the body. No one had proven he was dead, and no one ever would. McNabb's last obsession. He didn't go back to work, not really. The department had given him time off. Mandatory. They called it a break. He called it bullshit. Because how could he rest when he knew the truth? Knew that the Muffin Man was still out there. So he didn't stop. Didn't stop checking reports. Didn't stop chasing whispers. Didn't stop watching. Because he knew. One day, it would happen again. One day, someone would wake up to an empty bed, or a family would be found torn open, or another box would arrive at his door. And when it did, McNabb would be ready. This time, he wouldn't be too slow. This time, he would catch him, wouldn't he? Elsewhere, a man sat in a diner sipping his coffee. He was clean, composed, invisible. A newspaper lay folded beside him, untouched. The waitress approached, smiling. "Can I get you anything else?" The man smiled back, calm, friendly, harmless, just a muffin. Chapter X, The Last Body Before the Silence. The city had barely begun to breathe again. It had been weeks since McNabb's near brush with the Muffin Man. Weeks since the butchered remains of Daniel Brooks had been pulled from the darkness. Weeks since McNabb had found the bakery and failed to finish it. And then, just when people thought maybe, just maybe, he was gone. Another body appeared. The victim, her name was Laura Mitchell, 29. A journalist, one of the few still willing to say his name. She had covered the case from the start, refused to let it die. Every night, she went on air, talking about him, warning people, daring him, and he had listened. The crime scene. They found her on air, live. Laura was broadcasting from the KXLA studio when the feed cut to black. For 13 seconds, viewers saw nothing but silence and static. Then the image returned, and she was there, but not alive. Her body had been propped up in her chair, her throat cut deep, so deep her head lolled unnaturally. Her hands folded in her lap, and on the desk in front of her, a single muffin, still steaming, still fresh, and written across the screen in her blood, "Good night, Los Angeles." The feed cut out again, and when it returned, her body was gone. The vanishing. That was the last time anyone ever saw him. No more messages, no more bodies, no more muffins. He was just gone. For 5 years. No one knew why, no one knew where. But McNabb never stopped waiting, because killers like him, they always come back.
Hope y'all enjoyed that, man. I'm gonna have another banger for y'all
I'm gonna put that on the fan club here pretty soon. That one's gonna be 10 times